It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
It is often looked upon as a silly slapstick comedy filled with physical humor designed to delight the groundlings. I mean, after all, it is the shortest of all of Shakespeare's plays, and the only one with the word comedy in the title. But I'm here to tell you that the Comedy of Errors is more important to the Shakespeare authorship mystery than you might think at first glance. Welcome back, fellow Quillers, to this intriguing episode about a little play written by a lawyer for other lawyers as not only fun entertainment, but also laced with messages about religion, politics, and the law. Thank you for being here. Let's dive into mistaken identity, a popular topic here on Don't Quill the Messenger, through the examination of the Comedy of Errors. Francis Dolan of Miami University in Ohio. I know that sounds weird, doesn't it? Miami University in Ohio, but it's true. Francis Dolan refers to the Comedy of Errors as a case study in the fine, unstable line between comedy and tragedy. Curious that she uses the term case study, though she is not a lawyer or doctor of the law. She is, of course, an English professor, but nonetheless, she recognizes that the Comedy of Errors is a much more complex play than most critics would assess or have chosen to recognize over time. Indeed, Dolan's assessment of the play can get rather dark as she examines the tragic life of Aegeon, who loses wife and one half set of twins to a sea storm, watches the other set of twins leave him to venture out and seek of their brothers, and then sets out himself to find them all, only to land in Ephesus, forbidden to him as a Syracusan, upon pain of death. But he doesn't care at this point. It's one place he hasn't searched, and he's willing to die for his quest, a father willing to do anything for his lost son. This is not a problem play, however, such as Measure for Measure or All's Well That Ends Well or Two Gentlemen of Verona could be considered. Regardless of the legal and religious undertones, the Comedy of Errors is indeed a comedy. In fact, I see it as comedic genius in that it makes use of what might be considered low comic methods in the style of commedia dell'arte in order to deliver high comic humor to the target audience of highly educated persons. Regardless of its origin date, we truly don't know when that was, or its publication date, we do know when that was. It doesn't first appear in print until its inclusion in the first folio of 1623. But what we do have is the first recorded performance date. Now, some authorship scholars have suggested that Comedy of Errors demonstrates autobiographical aspects of the life of Edward de Vere, and we will examine those claims further as we go. But let's first continue to examine the origins of the play in order to set the stage, so to speak. On New Year's Day, 1577, an anonymous play titled The History of Errors was performed at Hampton Court. At that time, the 26-year-old Edward de Vere was now returned from his exploits in Italy and was experiencing what most de Vere biographers would agree, Shakespeare or not, was one of the most dramatic years of his life. But setting aside the connections to his life, let's just examine these dates. On New Year's Day, 1577, while the History of Errors was being performed, Will Shaxper of Stratford would have been the ripe old age of 12 years old. Now, perhaps at 12, the young Will was a full graduate, of the incredible grammar school in Stratford, you know, the little red schoolhouse that served as the preparatory school for his later doctoral education at the Mermaid Tavern. Perhaps the young boy genius was already funneling his plays to the elites at Hampton Court under his very well-known patron, the Earl of Southampton, who was all of 4 years old by New Year's Day, 1577. There's a problem here, Houston. Scholars across the board agree that this early play was probably an early version of the Comedy of Errors. But whether that is true or not, we do have a record of the Comedy of Errors being performed again at court during the Christmas revels of 1582-83, during a time when Edward de Vere was well out of favor with the Queen over the whole Anne Vavasour affair and other entanglements. The play was produced and presented by de Vere ally, the Earl of Sussex, probably in an attempt to help Edward regain favor with the Queen. The play's plot, focusing, of course, on the split identity of the lead character, false jealousy, the light side, Luciana, and the dark side, Adriana, of the wife character of the play, defense of a man's madness based in his wife's behavior, and a sovereign who foregoes the law in favor of mercy at the end. It was the entire Edward and his wife Anne plus his mistress Anne story being played out before the Queen. She was not moved. Edward remained exiled from court. But she did allow him to compete in the big jousting tournament that January, which, of course, the famous spear shaker won hands down. We have another record of a performance of Comedy of Errors occurring at Gray's Inn for the Christmas revels of 1594. This play was popular at Christmas time throughout its history. Obviously, it had the means to please its audiences. The performance at Gray's Inn is highly important for many reasons. The first reason is that many Orthodox scholars use this date to suggest that Comedy of Errors is, quote-unquote, an early work of the author. They look past the fact that if the History of Errors is the early draft version of this play is almost 20 years old by the time it is performed at Gray's Inn in 1594. It is worth noting that this date, 1594, also coincides with the meteoric rise of a brand new name on the scene, the name of Shakespeare, which was just months old, having been first seen in print with Venus and Adonis prior to the Christmas revel season. 6-7 months or so, right? Now, how can Venus and Adonis be such a masterpiece, the first publication with the Shakespeare name upon it, but Comedy of Errors performed just months later is dismissed as early juvenilia? Well, if the play is indeed almost 20 years old by 1594, that would make sense, wouldn't it? Let's also not forget that Edward de Vere was admitted to study law at Gray's Inn at the age of 17 in 1567. By 1594, he would have been an esteemed alumnus of the law school. And suddenly, Comedy of Errors, a play filled with legal references and issues, was being performed before the entire Gray's Inn membership of lawyers, professors, and students of the law. That's quite an audience. And according to one chronicler, the evening was packed with people, including members of the nearby rival Inner Temple School of Law. And the party got so out of hand that the anonymous organizer, wonder who that could be, referred to only as a sorcerer, was brought up on mock charges before a mock court to answer to his crimes of error and confusion. The evening went down in infamy as Gray's Inn's Night of Errors. No mention of the new star of poetry and playwrights, Shakespeare, being in any way connected to this night of infamy. It is also important to point out here that as an undeniable source for Comedy of Errors, the author of the play drew upon the comedy of the Roman playwright Plautus, most specifically the Menikmai. I believe that's the proper way to pronounce it. The Menikmai was passed down to us in, of course, Latin. But of course, the 12-year-old boy genius from Stratford was fluent in Latin in 1577, got his hands on a rare copy of Plautus at, the Stratford Public Library, translated it into English, and then wrote one of his early plays. Ridiculous. But definitely worthy of note is the fact that just as Comedy of Errors is finding its revival on stage before the Society of Lawyers at Gray's Inn, the first English translation of the Menikmai was entered into the Stationer's Registry by a W.W. Now, orthodoxy ascribes this to the writer William Warner, but the evidence of that is scant at best. Nonetheless, nobody was reading Plautus in English until the translation by W.W. was published in 1595, a full year after the famous Gray's Inn's Night of Errors. But it gets even better. Comedy of Errors isn't just a play about one set of twins, as we find in the Menikmai, but two sets of twins. The second set of twins, as clever as it is not entirely original to the author. It is also stolen from Plautus, another of his plays, called the Amphitruo. Though there is at least one other early adaptation of Amphitruo, I'm probably putting the emphasis in the wrong place, the wrong emphasis about Ephesus. Though there is at least one other early adaptation of this play by Plautus, it is never translated. It is never translated until the early 20th century, meaning that the author of Shakespeare had no choice but to have read Amphitruo in original Latin. Now, one of the reasons why it takes so long for the Amphitruo to be translated into English is due to how rare it is to find a Latin text of it. They only existed in Plautus collections, not as a standalone play. One of the few copies of a Latin Plautus collection during the time the Comedy of Errors was being performed existed in the personal library of the renowned tutor Sir Thomas Smith. Yes, the same Thomas Smith who praised the exceptional genius of his brightest pupil, Edward de Vere. Perhaps the most important connection to Edward's life, though, is the one that strikes a resounding bell throughout the themes of many of his plays, his relationship with women, and here, most importantly, his wife Anne. Now, unlike what we see in All's Well That Ends Well, the principal character in Comedy of Errors, Antipholus of Ephesus, is married to Adriana through arrangement of the sovereign of the land. Ring a bell? In this case, it's the Duke of Ephesus. The Duke takes the orphaned Antipholus in as a ward of the state, and then after his years of loyal service to the crown, the Duke rewards Antipholus with a marriage to the wealthy Adriana. This doesn't sound familiar at all, does it? Again, I'll also point out that the metaphors in the play, the two antiphalases split in half. The Duke actually says at much near the end of the play that is the case. There are two. One is the genius of the other, he says, which is real and which is the spirit. Also, the two sisters, Adriana essentially translating as the dark side of one half, and Luciana essentially translating as the light side of the other half, as in the two sides of the moon, for instance. This is a very important metaphor within the play, that there are two sides of us. And the author is suggesting that there are two sides of him. He's also suggesting that his darker side is brought out through the darker side of his relationship with his wife, but that they can reunite if they embrace the brighter sides of themselves and reunite themselves together as well. This is also reflective, pardon the pun, of the two sides of religion that are demonstrated within the play, as well as the two sides of the law. Now, Eric Hines, professor at the School of Law, Queen Mary, University of London, refers to Comedy of Errors as highly illustrative of both private and public law. He references that the play includes a trial, the trial of Aegeon at the beginning of the play for being unlawfully in Ephesus. There is more than one breached contract involving money, a gold chain, a ring, and debts owed between parties. There's also a standoff between monarchical and parliamentary powers. Hines accurately describes these legal elements as historical curios within an otherwise lighthearted venture, and he's right. And when we consider the audience the play was written and historically performed for, that all makes total sense. Hines tells us the play is pervasively structured by an array of socio-legal dualisms: master, servant, husband, wife, native, alien, parent, child, monarch, parliament, buyer, seller. And all of these confront fraught transitions from pre-modern to early modern forms of the law. These fundamentally legal relationships fuel character and action even where no conventionally legal norm or procedure is at issue, he says. I agree. The errors in the play constantly serve to bring attention to unstable and shifting relationships of dominance and submission between dueling forces, indicative of Edward's life and his relationships with the Queen, his father-in-law, Lord Burleigh, his wife Anne, his own servants and the servant spies of his father-in-law, and the legal transitions occurring during his time from feudal aristocratic to more commercial forms of the law. It's a brilliant, theatrically charged masterclass, and hilarious too, created for an audience of aristocrats and lawyers to enjoy. This also explains why there is no record of any public performance at any playhouse of this play. None. No record of any quarto version, and indeed no record of its publication prior to its inclusion in the first folio in 1623, almost 50 years after it was first performed in 1577 for the Queen. It was written for, and was obviously popular with, an audience of peers of the realm. Now, Carolyn Sale, English professor at the University of Alberta, Canada, would appear to agree, as she writes that much of the pleasure of this play is derived from its invitation to audiences to understand English common law as a law of common reason arising from the people in their aggregate. That's a curious take on it, though. If you believe the play was written by a country bumpkin actor looking to make a buck from his writings, why would Shakespeare of Stratford ever take the time to write this very specific play for a very specific audience that was never intended for the public playhouses? Great question. Sale admits that the Comedy of Errors appeals to its audience to construe the errors of the law in order to affirm what she calls the collective rationality of the audience as law makers. Well, of course, the audience it was written for were the lawmakers, the monarchy, the Privy Council, lawyers, and judges were the intended audience of this play from its first inception all the way through its history until it disappears for 30 years before it is included in the first folio. So we get it in 1577. We get it again in 1583. We get it again in 1594. And then it disappears until 1623 when it shows up in the folio. Sale, who I believe recognizes that Shakespeare must have been a lawyer, references the trial scene in The Merchant of Venice as affirming the importance of the ideals of common law jurisprudence by showing how they can be abused. She references Measure for Measure as an extended spectacle of judicial authority, drawing specific attention to Act 5 for demonstrating the importance of the common law as a discursive phenomenon dependent upon the participation of the community for its vitality. Sale would tie these three plays together then for placing the audience into active relation to the law as it appeals to them as the makers of common law. Precisely. An audience of lawyers and statesmen, not the public groundlings. Of course, no surprise that Measure for Measure also appears for the first time in print only in the first folio. There are no recorded public performances of that play at any playhouse either. The first and only recorded performance prior to the Restoration is during the Christmas revels of 1603-1604, which was also the much celebrated marriage festivities of Susan de Vere and Philip Herbert, Earl of Pembroke, one of the dedicatees of the first folio. It is well documented that King James ordered the performances of multiple Shakespeare plays during that highly celebrated holiday/marriage season. And footnote, King James walked Susan de Vere down the aisle, gave her to the Earl of Pembroke in absence of her father, who was thought to be deceased by then. And for more on that, you can find my bonus episodes on Is Edward Dead in the feature bonus episode library at our Patreon page. But again, I have to ask, why would the Stratford man even spend 1 second writing Measure for Measure? To what end? Certainly not for the public playhouses. Only for an audience of elites. But back to the Comedy of Errors and the topic of marriage. The author sets the play in Ephesus for a very specific reason. Of course, the original is set in Italy. But he chooses Ephesus for a very specific reason, and that is because it's connected to St. Paul's epistle to the Ephesians, which expounds greatly upon the institution of marriage. In fact, Ephesians chapter 5, verses 21 through 33 are entirely dedicated to Christian marriage. Some of those verses are even used in today's wedding ceremonies by brides and grooms in their vows section or in the ceremony section because of how much they apply to Christian marriage. Among other things, it reads, "He who loves his wife loves himself." This play, like so many others, including Measure for Measure, is an apology to Anne Cecil from a penitent husband. It is important to note that a 1582 translation of St. Paul's epistle to the Ephesians was published anonymously, but dedicated to none other than Anne Cecil. 1582 was the year Edward reunited with his estranged wife. Was he the anonymous translator of this message of love from St. Paul about marriage? Probably. And let's not forget that by Christmas of that year, Comedy of Errors is being presented before the Queen as an appeal on behalf of Edward to return to court. Now that the two halves of himself had been reunited, he is reunited with his wife. The Anne Vavasour affair and the illegitimate child are sort of squirreled away for a nice little sum of money, and the Queen allows her champion to compete to victory over all of the jousting men of her kingdom that January. 5 months after that, in June, he is finally allowed to return to court. You really can't write this stuff. The works of Shakespeare is truly the full history of the workings of the Elizabethan court and then some aspects later of the Jacobean court. Comedy of Errors is part of that history, including the edgy history of Catholicism versus Protestantism set within the backdrop of a notoriously pagan city known for its connection to sorcery and witchcraft. These themes are also present throughout the play, with the Syracusans particularly making Catholic references to things like rosary beads and crossing themselves in prayer, and the comments about what's happening in Ephesus being caused by sorcery and witchcraft, this confusion that is occurring, that's happening. Near the end of the play, we find the Syracusans seeking refuge within a religious temple or church, sanctuary, where the abbess rules completely. This is remarkable, since Protestants basically completely did away with such an option for women. There was no choice anymore for women. Under the Protestant rule, there was no choice anymore for women to enter a convent and accept religious orders instead of a husband. In fact, we find in the abbess a very unique character who bespeaks the noble and authoritative maternal figure who has been living the virginal life of a priestess, but then comes forward from the temple like a Greek goddess a la Due Machina style of the great Greek playwrights. Due Machina, God from the machine. It could only be more complete if she actually descended to the stage via some sort of mechanical contraption from above. But here, the contraption is the stage convention that places this character in the role of the queen, the virgin queen. Elizabeth, who basically sought to replace the Virgin Mary in her country's religion and the reverence of her subjects. The great abbess, who solves the problems of identity, heals marriages, reunites families, and settles disputes of the law, all in one fell swoop. As Dolan points out so astutely, one of the key parallels in the play to Elizabethan life deals more with embracing similarities rather than accommodating differences. And here we see the playwright drawing upon references of split identity while also showing us what happens when those splits are healed, reunited, and giving the power to this all-knowing, all-seeing, all-powerful female character at the end who solves all the problems at once through her power and her wisdom. Elizabeth witnessed what her Catholic older sister did to the realm in the name of religion. She understood the complexities of dealing with her Protestant Puritan subjects, some of whom were her most trusted advisors. And she really didn't care about how people prayed to God as long as they remained loyal to her and England. This, of course, caused a major problem with the Pope calling her a heretic and outright sanctioning her murder. But sans the Catholic extremists who wanted her dead, Elizabeth was actually a very tolerant queen when it came to religion. This is why I believe she was the true instigator of what would become the King James Bible. I believe that project began under her and was meant to be the Queen Elizabeth Bible. Her personality and her rule and reign demonstrates to me more of a sovereign who wanted an English Bible that could be used in her country and could help reunite and unite these factions of religion that were existing within England at the time. I believe it was meant to be the Queen Elizabeth Bible, but the project was so large an undertaking that it just didn't get completed until long after she was dead. Nonetheless, we see in Comedy of Errors what looks like for Catholic Antipholus and Dromio to find themselves in a foreign land, but fear religious persecution less than that of simply being foreigners. Right? As Syracusans, they are forbidden to be in Ephesus on pain of death. Not because they're Catholic, but because of a trade squabble between their duke and the Duke of Ephesus. Imagine what De Vere must have felt traveling through Catholic France and Italy, and yes, Syracusa of Sicily, as a Protestant Englishman. He couldn't hide that he was a Protestant Englishman. Obviously, what he discovered was Catholics who were more focused on the similarities between him and them than they were on the differences. Even if, as we see in Comedy of Errors, that sometimes similarities can be the hardest aspects of life to navigate without error. As Dolan suggests, perhaps our author was making a point about reconciling identity, sameness, and the union of two into one, which is why the play is so focused on marriage as well. Two become one. It's a theme we see referenced multiple times within the Shakespeare canon. Hamlet has some fun with it when he refers to Claudius as mother, and then spells out to his uncle that he must also be his mother, since he is now married to his mother, and man and wife are one flesh. This harkens back to St. Paul and his epistle to the Ephesians. He who loves his wife loves himself. Two become one. As we see in the text of Comedy of Errors, Act 2, Scene 2, undividable, incorporate, says Adriana as she lectures the wrong Antipholus on what a husband should be to his wife. There is so much marriage advice in this play that it almost seeks to channel St. Paul himself. And like St. Paul, much of the advice comes from characters who live outside of marriage. Go figure. This advice actually comes from the women in the play. They're not like St. Paul in that way. but they're unmarried. It's Luciana and it's Amelia the Abbess who deliver some of the strongest advice about marriage. Two women who literally don't know anything about marriage because they're not married. Well, Amelia is married to Egeon, but hasn't been with him for some 20 years. Advice about marriage from women outside of marriage, just like the Queen. However, the plot of Comedy of Errors resolves itself not through St. Paul's famous advice, or even the advice of the women in the play about marriage. Advice that says that you must submit or acquiesce, act as one flesh. That advice is poor advice in this play. Imagine what would have happened if Adriana doesn't question the strange activity of her presumed husband. Imagine if she submits and acquiesces to this strange behavior by the wrong Antipholus, believing him to be her husband and believing her duty as a wife to do as he says. We get no resolution then. Is Edward confessing that Anne was right to question his behavior? And that only through the questioning of that aberrant behavior are we able to find resolution and reunion in the end? This apology to a wife includes acknowledgement that she must be her own person and partner in the marriage. Navigate similarities through embracing differences. Assert where necessary in the service to your spouse. Don't allow his double self to bring about his own ruin. Consolidate the man into one. Forgive his darker side. Reunite him with his best self. That's the message. Nonetheless, let us not forget the audience the play was composed for, revised for, performed for, and then later preserved for. We could do an entire episode on the restoration versions of the play, including William Davenant, who decided to combine this play with Much Ado About Nothing and stick Beatrice and Benedict in the middle of it. Weird, but probably effective for ticket sales at the time. We could embrace the Victorian versions of the play that dwell almost completely upon the St. Paul epistle connection and attempt to guide wives into submission to their husbands. Very Victorian. But why? Those are truly corruptions of the play being used for different purposes. In Davenant's case, to sell tickets and make money. In the case of Victorians, to further promote a very misogynistic, sexist view of the world. There are entire worlds of the Comedy of Errors, as there are indeed entire worlds of errors leading to comedy. But it's only through modern productions that the play has really found its greatest audience. A modern audience composed of laypersons, middle-class workers, professionals, teachers, doctors, yes, lawyers, politicians, and everything in between. But that wasn't the intent of the author at the time, unless he could foresee that today's quote-unquote common audiences would be far more educated than the groundlings of his time. Because I think we have easily established that this play wasn't originally intended for the common audience. That said, I'm in the process of bringing this play to the stage for my second time in my career as a producer and director of Shakespeare. I intend to embrace the Plautin and Commedia origins of the play in a most farcical manner. Funny word, the word farce. Derives from the Italian word farcire, which literally means to stuff. And as we have explored, our author stuffed this play. He stuffed it with themes and messages connected to his own life, He stuffed it with connections to the world of the Elizabethan court around him and the world of the law and students of the law of his time. But he also stuffed it with some great physical humor, situation comedy, delightful characters, and, of course, bawdy jokes. Because what's a Shakespeare play without some bawdy jokes? If you find yourself in Southern Oregon this June, be sure to attend performances of The Comedy of Errors, the Bard's shortest play, paired with repertory performances of Hamlet, the Bard's longest play. And to find out more about that, you can visit roguevalleyshakespeare.com, roguevalleyshakespeare.com. Southern Oregon is a beautiful place during the month of June. We perform outdoors at Walport Family Cellars, Shakespeare in the vines, under the canopy of old-growth oak trees in a beautiful lawn, accompanied with wonderful wine from the Applegate Valley. Be sure to watch for a future episode where we will explore what it is like to prepare for playing the role of Hamlet. As I invite my wife Annie to join us for another episode, I have twice played the coveted role of the melancholy Dane, and I've produced and directed the play 4 times so far. This will be my 5th time. And this time, Annie will play Hamlet, following in the tradition long established by great actresses such as Sarah Bernhardt, Charlotte Cushman, and Sarah Siddons, among other ladies who have tackled the role throughout the last 2 centuries or so. It ought to be a fascinating look into the world's most famous character ever created for the stage. And we'll discuss with Annie what it's been like for her to prepare for this performance, what she's done, what she's tackled, what's been difficult, what it's like to look into the mind of this genius character, I believe the smartest character ever written. So it ought to be a fascinating episode. So look forward to that to come soon. In the meantime, Quiller Nation, don't forget to visit our Patreon page to learn more about how you can support the program and unlock that growing library of bonus feature episodes with more than 100 hours of intriguing content available there now. Be sure to join our email subscriber list by clicking on the button right on the homepage of our website so that you can stay informed about all things Quiller in nature, including possible future events, upcoming future episodes, and of course, bonus episode information. Just visit don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com. Click on the subscribe button. You can also get to the Patreon page right from there. There's a Patreon button. And click right there. Makes everything all in one place really easy to do. So please visit don'tquillthepodcast.com. Thank you all so much for being here, for joining me, for supporting this program over the years. We couldn't do it without you. We say that a lot, but we really mean it, and it is true. And we wouldn't want to do it without you either. So thank you again for being here, for being a part of the Quiller Nation. I love you all, and until next time, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.